In the final, frigid days of the spring of 1924, a column of black smoke rose above the isolated hills of Andalusia, Spain. It was a greasy, unnatural smoke that clung to the olive groves and stained the pristine sky. It rose from the St. Jude's Orphanage for Unwed Mothers, an institution built to hide secrets, and it was a funeral pyre for 32 infant children. When the authorities finally arrived, summoned by a breathless farmer from the valley below, they found the nursery wing reduced to a skeletal ruin of charred stone and smoldering timbers. Inside, they found nothing that could be recognized, only the suggestion of 32 small cribs, now little more than blackened metal frames, each one a silent testament to an unspeakable loss. The sole survivor, a young nun named Sister Agnes, was discovered wandering the grounds, her habit singed, her face a mask of vacant horror. She never spoke another word for the rest of her life. The official story, issued with solemn authority by both the regional government and the Catholic Church, was a simple and heartbreaking tragedy. A narrative of faulty wiring, of old, dry timber, and of a swift, merciless blaze that had overwhelmed the staff before they could reach the nursery. Sister Agnes, they said, had suffered a complete psychotic break, her mind shattered by the trauma of failing to save the innocent lives entrusted to her care. The Church, in its wisdom, sealed the records to protect the privacy of the grieving mothers and declared the grounds consecrated but forever closed. The fire at St. Jude's became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale of fate's cruel hand. But that official story was a deliberate and calculated lie. It was a carefully constructed fiction designed to bury a truth so monstrous that its architects were willing to burn a building to the ground to hide it. The real story was not one of accident, but of conspiracy, not of faulty wires, but of cold-blooded, methodical execution. Buried for nearly a century in the sealed archives of the diocese and in the desperate, hidden writings of a disgraced doctor, the truth reveals that there was no fire. Not at first. The fire was merely the final act of a cover-up, the last shovel of dirt on a mass grave, meant to erase a horror that had been unleashed within those hallowed, isolated walls. The story you are about to hear was silenced for nearly a century, hidden in sealed archives and the desperate writings of a lone witness. We believe no truth should stay buried forever. To join a community dedicated to uncovering history's darkest chapters, subscribe and hit the bell. And as we descend into this dark chapter of the past, tell us what state or country you're bearing witness from in the comments. To understand the crime that was committed at St. Jude's, one must first understand the world in which it took place. Spain in the 1920s was a nation of profound contradictions. It was a country clinging desperately to the past, a land where the power of the Catholic Church was nearly absolute, particularly in the poor, rural South. Life was governed by ancient rhythms of faith, harvest, and tradition. In villages carved into the Andalusian hills, the word of the local priest was law, and the authority of the regional bishop was akin to that of a king. This was a society suffocated by a rigid moral code, where honor was a family's most precious commodity and shame was a disease more feared than influenza. And there was no greater shame, no more indelible a stain, than a daughter bearing a child out of wedlock. St. Jude's Orphanage was a product of this world. It was not a place of charity, but a place of containment. Built a decade earlier with funds from a wealthy benefactor, it was deliberately constructed miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding, unpaved road. Its isolation was its primary feature. Here, families of means could quietly send their disgraced daughters to carry their burdens in secret, to deliver their children away from the prying eyes and gossiping tongues of their communities. The institution was run with an iron will by Mother Superior Elena, a woman in her late 50s whose piety was matched only by her severity. She saw St. Jude's not as a sanctuary, but as a penitentiary for the soul. The young women were the fallen, and their infants were the living symbols of their sin. Her loyalty was not to the mothers or the children, but to the unblemished reputation of the institution and, by extension, to the Church itself. Overseeing St. Jude's and the entire diocese was Bishop Matteo Valerio. He was not a humble country priest who had risen through the ranks. He was a political animal, a man who understood power. From his ornate office in the city, Bishop Valerio managed his dominion with the skill of a master strategist. He believed the Church was the bedrock of Spanish civilization, a fortress of moral order standing against the rising tides of modernism, socialism, and godless science. Any threat to the Church's authority, any crack in its facade of infallibility, was not just a theological problem. It was a threat to civilization itself. He saw scandal as a cancer, and he believed in excising it with surgical precision, no matter the cost. His concern was not for the salvation of individual souls, but for the preservation of the institution that governed them all. Into this rigid, unforgiving world came two individuals who would become the unwilling witnesses to the unfolding conspiracy. The first was Sister Agnes, a young novice barely out of her teens. Where Mother Superior Elena was stone, Agnes was water. She possessed a simple, profound kindness that the other nuns mistook for naivete. She did not see the infants as symbols of sin, but simply as blameless children who deserved love. She spent every possible moment in the nursery, humming lullabies to the newborns, her presence a small pocket of warmth in the cold, sterile environment of the orphanage. The second was Dr. Alejandro Vance, a young, ambitious physician from Madrid. He had been assigned to the region as part of a government initiative to bring modern medicine to the countryside. His posting at St. Jude's was considered a provincial backwater, a place for him to bide his time. Dr. Vance was a man of science, trained to observe, diagnose, and cure. He believed in data, in evidence, and in the moral imperative to save lives. He was polite and respectful to the clergy, but privately he viewed their reliance on prayer and their suspicion of modern medicine with a mixture of frustration and disdain. He could not have known that his medical logbook, a simple record of temperatures, symptoms, and treatments, would one day become the single most important testament to a mass murder. These four individuals, the calculating bishop, the severe Mother Superior, the compassionate nun, and the rational doctor, were set on a collision course, brought together by a secret that was gestating in the blood of the 32 infants sleeping silently in the nursery of St. Jude's. The catalyst for the tragedy at St. Jude's did not arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic pronouncement. It began, as most pestilence does, in silence. It started in the body of a single, unnamed infant in cot number 7, a boy born only 3 weeks prior. The first sign was a fever, an unremarkable event in a nursery filled with fragile lives. Sister Agnes, during her morning rounds, noticed the child's unusual warmth and the faint, lace-like rash beginning to bloom across his chest. She swaddled him in a fresh, cool blanket and made a note for Dr. Vance's daily visit. Mother Superior Elena, observing from the doorway, saw only a common childhood ailment. "The sins of the mother visit the child," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Pray for his soul, sister. Penance can be a fever of the body as well as the spirit." When Dr. Vance arrived that afternoon, his clinical eye saw something more troubling. He was a man of patterns, and the pattern here was wrong. The fever was too high, the infant's breathing too shallow. But it was the rash that truly unsettled him. It was not the familiar red blush of measles or the spots of chickenpox. These were darker, almost purple, and coalesced into shapes resembling tiny, intricate bruises just beneath the skin. He recorded the infant's temperature, a dangerously high 40 degrees Celsius, in his logbook. He noted the rash with a detailed sketch circling the unusual pattern. Underneath, he wrote a single, questioning word: anomalo. He brought his concerns to Mother Superior Elena in her Spartan office, a room that smelled of old paper and beeswax. "Mother Superior," he began, trying to keep his tone level and scientific, "the infant in cot 7 presents with symptoms I do not recognize. The fever is severe, and the rash is atypical. I would like to move him to an isolated room, as a precaution." Mother Superior Elena did not look up from the accounts ledger she was reviewing. A precaution against what, doctor? Hysteria? You city physicians see phantoms in every cough. It is a fever. The child is weak. We will pray. With respect, this is not a matter of prayer alone, Dr. Vance insisted, a new edge to his voice. This is a matter of public health. There are 31 other children in that room. If this is contagious... Everything is contagious, Dr. Vance, she cut him off, finally raising her cold, gray eyes to meet his. Weakness is contagious. Fear is contagious. Sin is most contagious of all. You will not disrupt the order of this house. You will treat the child's fever. I will handle the state of his soul. That is all. Dr. Vance left her office, feeling a profound sense of foreboding. He was a man of medicine trapped in a fortress of dogma. He had no authority here. He was a guest, an outsider tolerated for the veneer of modernity he provided. He returned to the nursery and did what he could, administering aspirin crushed in water and sponging the infant's burning skin. Sister Agnes stood beside him, her face a portrait of anxiety, her whispered prayers a constant, gentle hum. She watched the doctor's hands, so sure and methodical, yet she could see the worry etched in the deep lines of his brow. She saw him draw a small sample of blood, sealing it in a glass vial, an act that felt both clinical and strangely sacred, as if he were collecting a relic of a tiny, suffering saint. Within 48 hours, Dr. Vance's fears were realized. The infant in cot number 12, and then the one in number 5, began to exhibit the same violent fever, and then the same terrible violet rash appeared on their skin, spreading faster than on the first child. The sickness was moving through the nursery with an unnatural intelligence, leaping from one cot to the next with terrifying speed. The quiet, rhythmic breathing of the nursery was replaced by a chorus of pained, shallow gasps. A strange, sweet, and sickly odor began to permeate the air, a smell that clung to the stonework and defeated the harsh scent of the carbolic soap the nuns used to scrub the floors. Dr. Vance now dispensed with politeness. He confronted Mother Superior Elena again, this time in the hallway outside the nursery, his logbook held open in his hand like a writ. 3 more are sick, he said, his voice low and urgent. This is a contagion. I don't know what it is, but it is aggressive, and it is spreading. You must allow me to establish a quarantine. We must separate the sick from the healthy, now. And where do you propose we do that? She retorted, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. This is an orphanage, not a Madrid hospital. We have the nursery, the chapel, and the dormitory for the fallen women. Do you wish to put sick infants in the pews? To mix the symbols of sin with the instruments of salvation? I wish to save their lives, Disiad. He nearly shouted, the sound echoing in the stone corridor. He caught himself, lowering his voice again. We can use the laundry room. It has a separate entrance. It is far from ideal, but it will have to do. We need to act. You are creating chaos where there is none, she said, her voice dangerously calm. God has sent this house a trial. It is a test of our faith. We will meet it with prayer and fortitude, not with panic and the rearrangement of rooms. But Dr. Vance ignored her. He turned to Sister Agnes, who had been listening from the nursery doorway, her face pale. Sister, he commanded, his tone shifting from one of frustration to one of desperate authority. Help me. We are moving the sick children. For a moment, an eternity seemed to pass as Sister Agnes stood, frozen between the two opposing forces that governed her world, the unbending will of her Mother Superior and the desperate plea of the man of science. She looked from the doctor's frantic eyes to the stone-cold certainty in Elena's face. Then she looked past them, into the nursery, where the faint cries of the sick children were growing weaker. Her choice was made. Without a word, she turned and walked to cot number 7. She gently lifted the first sick child, whose small body was now almost entirely covered in the dark, bruised rash, and carried him out of the room, following the doctor towards the laundry. Mother Superior, Elena, watched them go, her expression unreadable, a statue of righteous fury. The first crack in the institution's rigid order had appeared. The laundry room became a makeshift infirmary, a circle of hell Dante had not imagined. The air was thick with the steam of boiling linens and the cloying smell of sickness. Dr. Vance and Sister Agnes worked tirelessly, a two-person army against an invisible enemy. By the end of the week, there were 9 infants in the laundry room, their small bodies racked with fevers that did not break. Dr. Vance's logbook filled with frantic, increasingly desperate entries. He described the disease's terrifying progression. After the fever and the rash came a disturbing neurological phase. The infants would stiffen, their tiny backs arching in spasms of agony. A thin, bloody foam would fleck their lips. Their cries became weak, high-pitched, and unnervingly constant. It was a sound that drilled into the soul, the sound of pure, helpless suffering. Sister Agnes became a ghost, moving between the cots, whispering prayers that were no longer for salvation, but for a swift and merciful end. She had loved these children in the abstract, as God's creatures. Now, she loved them in the particular, each one an individual soul whose agony she witnessed firsthand. She saw the light fade from their eyes. She held their small, convulsing hands. Her faith, once a source of comfort and certainty, was becoming a source of profound and terrible questions. What God would permit this? What trial required the systematic torture of the innocent? Then, the first child died. It was the boy from cot number 7, the one who had started it all. His passing was not peaceful. After a final, violent seizure, he simply stopped breathing. Dr. Vance, exhausted and hollow-eyed, pressed his stethoscope to the boy's chest and heard only silence. He stood there for a long moment, his scientific detachment completely stripped away, leaving only the raw anguish of a healer who had been defeated. He looked at Sister Agnes, whose face was stained with tears, and saw his own despair mirrored in her eyes. He placed the small, still body in a wooden crate, the only thing he could find that resembled a coffin, and covered it with a white linen sheet. That evening, he sought out Mother Superior Elena for the third and final time. He found her not in her office, but in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, her back ramrod straight. "A child is dead," Dr. Vance said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "And 6 more are close to it. The quarantine is failing. The disease is airborne, or more virulent than I imagined. I don't know. I need help. You must send a message to the bishop. He has to contact the health ministry in Seville. We need doctors, medicine, a proper hospital." "Mother Superior." Elena finished her prayer before slowly rising and turning to face him. Her expression was not one of grief or alarm. It was one of cold, hard calculation. The moment she had feared had arrived. The integrity of her institution was threatened not just by the disease, but by the weakness of this secular man. "You will do no such thing," she said, "and neither will I. To contact the authorities is to admit that we have a plague within these walls. It is to admit that God has visited upon this house a sign of His displeasure. The newspapers will come. The government will interfere. The families of these women will be shamed. Our benefactors will withdraw their support. St. Jude's will be finished, a monument to scandal and pestilence." "Children are dying," Dr. Vance's voice cracked. "Does that mean nothing to you?" "It means that we must have strength," she replied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The world cannot know of this. This is a trial for us, Doctor, a burden we must carry alone. I have already sent a message to the groundskeeper. The main gate is to be locked. No one enters and no one leaves, until this unpleasantness has passed." Dr. Vance stared at her, a wave of cold horror washing over him. He finally understood. She was not in denial. She was in control. This was not about saving the children. It was about saving the institution. The shame she spoke of was not for the mothers, but for the church. He looked past her, through the chapel doors, towards the long, unpaved road that was the only connection to the outside world. He saw the massive iron gate at the end of it. It was no longer a welcoming entrance. It was the door to a tomb. She had not quarantined the disease. She had quarantined them all. The silence of St. Jude's was no longer a matter of policy. It was now a matter of force. And in that chilling realization, Dr. Vance knew that the fate of the remaining 31 infants had just been sealed. The clang of the groundskeeper's bolt sliding into place at the main gate was a sound Dr. Vance would never forget. It was a sound of finality, a metallic punctuation mark at the end of a death sentence. His world, which had once been the expansive and optimistic realm of modern medicine, had shrunk to the confines of St. Jude's cursed grounds. He was no longer a physician, he was a warden in a dying ward, a prisoner alongside the very souls he was trying to save. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of suffering and exhaustion. The disease, now fully unleashed, tore through the remaining population of the nursery with breathtaking ferocity. Children who had been healthy one morning were feverish by noon and dead by nightfall. The makeshift infirmary and the laundry room overflowed, forcing them to use a small adjoining storage closet for the newest victims. Soon, there were more dead than living. Dr. Vance's logbook, once a testament to scientific rigor, became a chronicle of despair. His neat, clinical script devolved into a frantic scrawl. He ceased trying to diagnose the unknown pathogen and began documenting what he now saw as a crime. Day 8. 3 more deaths. Infants from cots, 19, 21, and 2. Mother Superior refuses all requests for aid. We are entombed. Sister Agnes is a specter of herself. I fear for her sanity as much as I do for the children. He ran out of aspirin. He ran out of clean bandages. All he had left was cool water and a dwindling supply of carbolic acid, which did nothing to halt the infection's relentless march. The small wooden crates he used for coffins were piling up in the ice house behind the kitchen, a grotesque parody of a storeroom. The groundskeeper, a stoic man named Ricardo, with eyes that had seen too much, would wordlessly take them each morning and disappear towards the far end of the property, a shovel slung over his shoulder. Sister Agnes moved through the nightmare in a state of shock-induced grace. The part of her that could feel, that could weep, that could question God, seemed to have shut down. She functioned on instinct, a deep, maternal imperative that superseded her own terror and grief. She cleaned the children, held them, and hummed the old lullabies. Her voice a thin, reedy whisper in the chorus of suffering. She no longer prayed for their lives. She performed the last rites herself, anointing their foreheads with holy water from a small vial she kept in her pocket, a sacrament offered in defiance of a God she no longer understood. Dr. Vance watched her, a silent, hollowed-out figure of compassion, and knew he was witnessing the slow-motion destruction of a human soul. Meanwhile, Mother Superior Elena maintained her icy composure. She saw the mounting death toll not as a tragedy, but as a logistical problem that was spiraling out of her control. The doctor was becoming increasingly unstable, his pleas turning into demands, his desperation bordering on insubordination. The other nuns were succumbing to fear, their prayers laced with a hysterical edge. The secrecy of St. Jude's was compromised from within. She knew she could not contain this alone. The situation now required a higher authority, an ecclesiastical power that could not be questioned. On the morning of the 12th day, after the death toll had reached 17, she made her decision. She summoned Ricardo, the groundskeeper, the only man she trusted implicitly, for his loyalty was to the bishop first and to God second. She did not write a letter that could be intercepted or misconstrued. She gave him a verbal message, her words precise and stripped of all emotion. Ride to the city, go to the bishop's palace, give him this message and this message only. The penance of St. Jude's has become a contagion of the soul. The flock is perishing. Your immediate guidance is required to prevent a public scandal. Do you understand, Ricardo? Those words, exactly. The man nodded, his face impassive. And if he asks for details? He will not, she replied. He will understand the meaning. Bishop Matteo Valerio sat in his study, a grand room paneled in dark, polished wood and lined with leather-bound books he had never read. A large, ornate crucifix of silver and ebony hung on the wall behind his desk, a symbol less of faith than of the power and wealth that faith commanded. He was reviewing diocesan financial reports, a task he found far more spiritually fulfilling than listening to the confessions of peasants. When his aide announced the arrival of the groundskeeper from St. Jude's, a flicker of irritation crossed his face. The orphanage was a necessary but distasteful part of his domain, a place for inconvenient problems to be quietly managed. Ricardo was shown in, his dusty, working man's clothes, a stark intrusion into the opulent sanctity of the office. He stood, cap in hand, and recited Mother Superior Elena's message verbatim. A contagion of the soul. The flock is perishing. Prevent a public scandal. The bishop's pen stopped moving. He sat perfectly still, his fingers steepled before him. He did not need details. He understood the coded language of his subordinate perfectly. Contagion did not mean a simple sickness. It meant an outbreak, something uncontrollable. The flock is perishing was not a metaphor. It meant children were dying in large numbers. And public scandal was the key that unlocked the entire meaning. This was a threat not to lives, but to the institution, to his institution. He dismissed Ricardo with a curt nod and a single instruction: return to your post. Tell the Mother Superior I am contemplating her message. No one else is to leave the grounds under any circumstances. Is that clear? Once he was alone, Bishop Valerio walked to the tall window overlooking the city plaza. He was a man who saw the world as a chessboard, and he was now faced with the most dangerous move of his career. He began to methodically analyze the situation, not as a pastor, but as a general. An unknown plague had broken out at the orphanage. Children were dying. The on-site physician, a man of science, and therefore untrustworthy, would be demanding action, demanding that the outside world be notified. He considered his options. Option 1. He could alert the Ministry of Health. Government doctors would descend upon the orphanage. They would find a house of horrors, run by nuns, under his authority. The newspapers, particularly the socialist and anti-clerical papers in Madrid, would feast on the story for months. Plague in church orphanage. Dozens of bastard infants dead. Clergy blamed for negligence and cover-up. The scandal would be catastrophic. It would raise questions about the church's competence, its sanitation, its very morality. People would see the plague as a divine judgment, a sign of God's wrath upon a sinful institution. Donations would dry up. His own position, his carefully cultivated reputation as a pillar of moral authority, would crumble. This option was unthinkable. Option 2, do nothing. Hope the disease burns itself out. But this was equally risky. The doctor, or one of the nuns, might panic and escape. A desperate mother might try to visit her child. The truth would crawl out from under the stone like a scorpion. The scandal would be delayed. But it would come eventually, and it would be worse for his inaction. This left only a third option, a terrible, radical, but utterly effective solution. The problem was not the disease. The problem was the evidence. The problem was the witnesses. If there were no sick children, there was no plague. If there were no witnesses, there was no story. The entire affair could be erased, cauterized like a gangrenous wound to save the body. The body, in this case, being the Holy Mother Church. His mind, unburdened by sentiment, saw the path with chilling clarity. A merciful end to the suffering of the remaining children, a complete cleansing of the sight, and a plausible, tragic story that would elicit sympathy, not suspicion. A fire, simple, common, and utterly destructive. It would explain the deaths, destroy the evidence of the disease, and sanctify the grounds through tragedy. It was perfect. The loss of 32 nameless, sin-born infants was a small, calculated price to pay for the preservation of the Church's unassailable authority and the moral order of Spain. Having made his decision, he acted with swift and ruthless efficiency. He sent a carriage to St. Jude's, not with medicine, but with a summons for Mother Superior Elena. She arrived late that evening, ushered into his study like a co-conspirator. She stood before his desk, her face pale in the gaslight, but her posture as rigid as ever. The bishop did not waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me everything," he commanded. She recounted the events of the past 2 weeks with detached precision. The strange symptoms, the rapid spread, the number of dead, the doctor's hysteria, the sealed gates. When she was finished, the room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Bishop Valerio rose and walked to stand before her, his voice low, intimate, and heavy with false piety. "You have faced a trial of biblical proportions, my daughter. A demonic pestilence has been sent to test us. And the greatest test is not the endurance of suffering, but the courage to end it." He looked directly into her eyes. "These children, their suffering is immense. Their souls are pure, but their bodies are tainted by a disease we cannot comprehend. To allow this to continue is not an act of faith, it is an act of cruelty. The Lord sometimes asks His most faithful servants to perform terrible duties in His name." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle upon her. He was not giving an order. He was granting a holy permission. "A merciful end is required," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "A release from their earthly torment, so that their untainted souls may fly to the arms of the Savior. We must prevent further suffering, and we must prevent this demonic seed from spreading beyond those walls and infecting the God-fearing people of this diocese. It is a necessary sacrifice to protect the wider flock." Mother Superior. Elena did not flinch. She had been expecting this. She had perhaps even been hoping for it. It was the absolution she needed, the transformation of a logistical nightmare into a sacred duty. Her own ambition and her desire for order were now perfectly aligned with the will of her superior, and by extension, the will of God. "And this aftermath?" she asked, her voice steady. "Will be a tragedy," the bishop said, turning away from her to gaze at the crucifix on his wall. "A terrible, accidental fire. A faulty wire in the nursery. God, in His infinite and mysterious wisdom, will have called His smallest angels home. The world will weep for us, Elena. They will pray for our loss. And the truth of this terrible trial, will be a burden that you and I shall carry alone, for the good of the Church." He gave her a small, heavy purse filled with coins. "For Ricardo, for his silence and his assistance, and for the quicklime." He then handed her a small, corked bottle containing a dark, viscous liquid. "The doctor's morphine. For the children. There must be no struggle. It must be a gentle sleep." Mother Superior. Elena took the bottle and the purse. When she looked up at the bishop, her eyes were clear, her resolve absolute. She was no longer just the head of an orphanage. She was an instrument of divine and episcopal will. She bowed her head. "As God wills it," she said. She returned to St. Jude's under the cover of darkness, the carriage wheels crunching on the gravel drive. As she walked toward the main building, she could hear the faint, high-pitched wails coming from the laundry. To anyone else, it was the sound of unbearable suffering. But to Mother Superior Elena, armed with her new and terrible purpose, it was the sound of a problem that would soon be solved. Inside, Dr. Vance and Sister Agnes were still awake, unaware that the battle they had been fighting so desperately had already been lost. A decision had been made in a distant, gilded room, and a sentence had been passed upon the innocent. All that remained was the execution. The final night at St. Jude's orphanage descended with an unnatural stillness. The usual chorus of suffering from the laundry room infirmary had quieted to a series of exhausted, shallow breaths. 23 infants were now dead. Only 9 remained, their small bodies clinging to a fragile thread of life. Dr. Vance, having not slept for what felt like a lifetime, was slumped over his small desk in the nursery, his head in his hands. His logbook lay open, the last entry a single, jagged line, where he had attempted to write, but had been overcome by a tremor in his hand. The scientific method had failed him. His training was useless. He was a man with a medical degree reduced to the primal, impotent role of a deathbed witness. Sister Agnes was kneeling on the cold stone floor beside the cots, her rosary beads slipping through her fingers, her lips moving in a silent, ceaseless prayer that had become more of a reflex than a plea. The door creaked open, and Mother Superior Elena entered. Her presence immediately altered the atmosphere in the room. She was not carrying a basin of water or a clean blanket. In one hand, she held a small lantern, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the other, she carried a tray. On the tray were 9 small bottles, the kind used for feeding infants, each filled with milk. Beside them sat the small, dark bottle the bishop had given her, and a single, unmarked syringe. Dr. Vance looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary. He saw the tray, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face. "What is that?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The bishop has sent a remedy," Mother Superior Elena said, her voice unnervingly calm and even. "A tonic from his own physician, to ease their suffering, to give them a peaceful sleep." Dr. Vance slowly rose to his feet. He was a doctor. He knew every remedy, every tincture, every opiate available. He looked at the dark bottle, then at the Mother Superior's eyes, and in their hard, resolute depths, he saw not mercy, but a terrifying, unholy purpose. "What is it?" he demanded, taking a step forward. "Let me see it." "It is a gift from God, administered through the authority of the bishop," she replied, placing the tray on a small table, her body shielding it from him. "You will not interfere, doctor. Your methods have failed. Now we will try the method of faith." "That's not a remedy," he said, his voice rising with a dawning horror. "That's poison." The word hung in the air, obscene and sacrilegious. Mother Superior. Elena turned to face him fully, her expression one of utter conviction. "It is a mercy. Do you not hear them? Their agony is an offense to God. They are trapped between this world and the next. The bishop has sanctioned a means to release them, to send their pure souls to heaven before they are further corrupted by this filth." Dr. Vance stared at her, his mind reeling. He was trying to process the monstrous logic she was presenting. This wasn't medicine. This was a theological execution. "You cannot do this," he stammered, his body trembling. "This is murder." "It is salvation," she corrected him, her voice like ice. "And you will not stand in its way." From the folds of her habit, she produced a large iron key. It was the key to the infirmary door. Before he could react, she moved with surprising speed, stepping out of the room, slamming the heavy wooden door shut, and turning the key in the lock. The loud, final thunk of the bolt echoed like a gunshot in the silent hallway. Dr. Vance threw himself against the door, rattling the handle, pounding his fists against the thick oak. "Let me out! In God's name, Elena, don't do this!" he screamed, his voice raw with panic and despair. But his cries were met only with the sound of her retreating footsteps. Inside the room, Sister Agnes had risen to her feet, her rosary falling to the floor. She had heard every word. Her mind, already fractured by weeks of trauma and grief, simply refused to accept the reality of what was happening. She looked from the locked door to the tray, with its 9 bottles of milk, now instruments of death. "Mother Superior," she called out, her voice small and trembling like a child's. "What is she doing?" Dr. Vance turned from the door, his face ashen. He looked at the young nun, at her wide, terrified eyes, and saw the last vestiges of her innocence about to be annihilated. "She's going to kill them, Agnes," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "She's going to kill them all." The truth of it finally pierced through Sister Agnes's shock. A low, guttural sound escaped her throat, a sound of pure animal grief. She backed away from the tray as if it were a venomous snake, shaking her head, her hands flying to her mouth. "No, no, the bishop. He would not. God would not." But Dr. Vance knew better. He had seen the bishop's kind before, men for whom power was the only true religion. He rushed to the room's single, small window. It was barred. He pulled at the iron, his muscles straining, his palms scraping raw against the rusted metal. But the bars held fast, cemented deep into the stone. They were trapped. They were to be the unwilling witnesses, their presence a perverse form of complicity in the crime. Then they heard it, the sound of the key turning in the lock again. The door swung open, but it was not Mother Superior Elena who stood there. It was Ricardo, the groundskeeper, his face a grim, unreadable mask. Behind him stood 2 other large men, Dr. Vance had never seen before, their faces hard and shadowed in the lantern light. "The Mother Superior requires your assistance, Doctor," Ricardo said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "I will not be a part of this," Dr. Vance spat, positioning himself between the men and the infants' cots. Ricardo simply gestured to his companions. They moved into the room with a brutal efficiency. One man seized Dr. Vance, pinning his arms behind his back with practiced ease. The doctor struggled, kicking and shouting, but the man's grip was like iron. The other man approached, Sister Agnes. She didn't struggle. She had collapsed in on herself, a statue of mute terror. He took her arm gently but firmly and pulled her to her feet. "Mother Superior." Elena stepped back into the room, her face serene, as if she were about to conduct a baptism. "You see, Doctor," she said, looking at the struggling physician, "this is the will of God. It cannot be opposed." She walked to the table and picked up the syringe. With a steady hand, she drew the dark liquid from the bishop's bottle, and one by one injected a small amount into each of the 9 bottles of milk, swirling them gently to mix the contents. The act was so methodical, so domestic, it was obscene. It was the gesture of a mother preparing her children for bed. "Sister Agnes," she commanded, her voice soft but unyielding, "you will feed the children. It is fitting that the last act of mercy they receive on this earth should come from the hand that has cared for them." The man holding Agnes pushed her forward. She stumbled, her eyes fixed on the tray. This was a choice beyond all comprehension: to participate in murder or to defy an order that was being presented as a holy sacrament. Her mind, pushed to its absolute limit, finally broke. The world began to dissolve at the edges, the lantern light becoming a blinding glare. The quiet gasps of the infants and the grunts of the struggling doctor merging into a single, deafening roar in her ears. She looked at the face of the first child, his skin marked with a terrible violet rash, his breath a faint whisper. She saw not sin, not a vessel of pestilence, but only a baby, an innocent baby. "I can't," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I cannot." "You will," Mother Superior Elena said, her voice hardening. She picked up the first bottle and tried to press it into Agnes's hand. At that moment, something inside Dr. Vance snapped. With a primal roar of fury, he drove his body backward, slamming the man holding him into the stone wall. The man's grip loosened for a split second, just long enough for Dr. Vance to wrench one arm free. He lunged not for Elena, but for the tray. He swept his arm across it, sending the 9 bottles crashing to the floor. They shattered, the mixture of milk and morphine splashing across the stone in a sickening pale pool. For a moment, everyone was frozen. The air was filled with the sound of Dr. Vance's ragged breathing and the sweet, cloying smell of the spilled liquid. Mother Superior. Elena's face, for the first time, twisted into a mask of pure rage. "You foolish, arrogant man of science," she hissed. "You have not saved them. You have only prolonged their agony. You have made this difficult when it could have been simple." She turned to Ricardo. "Hold him, hold them both. There is another way." She strode from the room and returned moments later, carrying a small doctor's bag, Dr. Vance's own bag. She rummaged through it and produced a bottle of chloroform and a thick wad of cotton. Her intent was clear. If they would not sleep peacefully, she would force them into unconsciousness first. Dr. Vance renewed his struggle, but the second man had now joined the first. They forced him to his knees, his face pressed against the cold, damp floor. He could only watch in impotent horror as Elena approached the first cot, the chloroform-soaked cotton in her hand. He saw Sister Agnes, held by Ricardo, her eyes wide and completely vacant, staring into a distance he could not imagine. She had retreated to a place within her own mind where this horror could not reach her. A high, keening sound began to emanate from her throat, a sound of a soul being torn apart. The climax of the tragedy at St. Jude's was not a moment of violence, but one of terrifying, methodical quiet. It was the soft hiss of the chloroform, the gentle press of cotton against a tiny face, followed by the clinical, precise prick of a needle. One by one, 9 times. Dr. Vance was forced to watch every single one, the names of the children repeating in his head like a litany of the damned. He heard Sister Agnes's keening sound slowly fade away into a choked silence. When the final act was done, Mother Superior Elena stood up, her work complete. The room was utterly still. The suffering had ended. She looked down at the broken, weeping doctor and the catatonic nun. "You see," she said, her voice filled with a terrible, righteous calm. "It is finished. God's will is done." The two men released them. Dr. Vance did not move. He remained on his knees, staring at the pool of milk and shattered glass on the floor. Sister Agnes slid down the wall into a crumpled heap, her eyes open but seeing nothing. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply went silent. It was a silence that was deeper and more absolute than any sound, a silence from which she would never return. The conspiracy had reached its bloody, quiet crescendo, and the cover-up was about to begin. The 9 small bodies lay wrapped in linen on the infirmary floor, their manufactured peace a grotesque counterpoint to the violence of the preceding moments. In the aftermath of the climax, a new and chilling phase of the conspiracy began, not of passion or panic, but of cold, grim logistics. Mother Superior Elena, her righteous fury having subsided into an unnerving calm, was now a quartermaster overseeing a grim cleanup. The mission was no longer to contain a disease, but to erase history itself. She turned her attention first to the witnesses. Dr. Vance was hauled to his feet by Ricardo's men, a profound and broken emptiness in his eyes where defiance had once burned. He offered no resistance. He was a shell, his scientific mind shattered by the medieval horror he had been forced to endure. Sister Agnes remained a crumpled figure on the floor, her consciousness having retreated to a place no one could reach. They were liabilities, loose threads in the tapestry of the lie that was being woven. "Take them to the cellar," Mother Superior Elena commanded, her voice crisp and devoid of any emotion. "Lock them in separate rooms. The doctor is not to be harmed, but he is not to be heard from. The sister is already gone." As the men dragged the doctor and carried the catatonic nun away, their footsteps echoing down the stone corridors, Elena turned to Ricardo. "Have you prepared the place, as the bishop instructed?" Ricardo nodded, his face impassive. "Behind the chapel. The pit is dug. The delivery was made this afternoon." "Good," she said. "We must move quickly. The work must be finished before dawn." What followed was a methodical and horrifying procession. The 9 murdered infants were placed into coarse burlap sacks, along with the 23 who had already succumbed to the disease, brought from their temporary tombs in the ice house. Ricardo and his men worked in the dim lantern light, their movements efficient and silent, like factory workers on a gruesome assembly line. There was no ceremony, no prayer. The bodies were now merely objects, evidence to be disposed of. They carried the sacks, 2 at a time, out the back of the orphanage and along a muddy path that led to the small, neglected cemetery behind the chapel. But they didn't stop at the rows of weathered stone crosses. They went past them, to a place where the earth was freshly turned, a gaping, rectangular pit that smelled of damp soil and decay. At the edge of the pit sat a half-dozen large paper sacks, bearing the stark label of a chemical supplier from the city. Ricardo slit one open with a knife, and a cloud of fine white powder billowed into the night air. Quicklime, a substance that would not only hasten the decomposition of the bodies, but would chemically burn away the flesh, leaving little for any future investigation to ever uncover. One by one, the burlap sacks containing the infants were dropped into the mass grave. They landed with soft, sickening thuds. Then, Ricardo and his men began to shovel the quicklime onto the bodies, the white powder covering the dark burlap, a profane parody of a gentle snowfall. When they were finished, they filled the grave with earth, tamping it down, working with the practiced rhythm of men accustomed to hard, unquestioning labor. Within an hour, it was done. The ground was level. 32 children had been utterly and completely erased from the world. Their task of disposal complete, they returned to the main building. The second phase of the plan was about to begin. Mother Superior Elena met them at the nursery door, her face illuminated from below by the lantern in her hand. She now looked like a figure from a Goya painting, a creature of shadow and grim purpose. "The nursery," she said. "Everything must be consumed." Ricardo's men brought cans of kerosene from the groundskeeper's shed. They moved through the nursery, splashing the flammable liquid over the small metal cots, the wooden floors, the curtains. The air became thick with the acrid smell of the accelerant, a smell that promised purification through destruction. Mother Superior Elena watched them, her expression unreadable. She was not destroying a room where children had slept. She was sanitizing a contaminated area, surgically excising a cancer from the body of her institution. Every drop of kerosene was a sacrament in this new, dark faith. When they were finished, she gave her final orders. "You will leave now," she told the two hired men, pressing a heavy purse of coins into the hand of each. "You will ride north. You will not stop until you are in another province. You were never here. This night never happened." The men nodded, their greed outweighing any nascent form of conscience, and melted back into the darkness from which they had come. Now only Elena and Ricardo remained in the nursery. "It is time," she said. "We will set the fire and then go to the cellar. We must retrieve the sister." "And the doctor?" Ricardo asked. "The bishop will deal with the doctor. Our instructions are to leave the sister. She is the centerpiece of the tragedy, the sole, traumatized survivor. Her madness will be the proof of the story's horror." It was the coldest, most calculated part of the entire conspiracy. Sister Agnes, the one person who had shown the children genuine love, was to be left behind as a prop. Her broken mind was the final crucial element of the cover-up, a living testament to a lie. They descended to the cellar and unlocked the door to Agnes's room. She was just as they had left her, sitting on the floor, her eyes wide and unseeing. She did not resist as Ricardo lifted her into his arms. They carried her up the stairs and back toward the main entrance, away from the nursery wing. Elena gave Ricardo a small book of matches. "Light it, and then go. Take the carriage and wait for me at the crossroads 5 miles from here." Ricardo went back to the nursery, struck a match, and tossed it into the kerosene-soaked room. The result was instantaneous, a great whoosh of sound as the vapors ignited, and a wall of orange flame erupted, greedily consuming the dry wood and fabric. Black smoke immediately began to pour from the windows. He did not watch it burn. He turned and walked away without a backward glance, his duty done. Elena laid Sister Agnes down on the cold ground of the courtyard, a safe distance from the spreading fire, arranging her like a doll in a tableau of grief. She took a moment to singe the edge of Agnes's habit with a lit taper, to smudge her face with soot from the nearby wall, adding the final touches of authenticity to her performance. Then she too turned and walked away, disappearing into the night to join her accomplice, leaving the pyre of St. Jude's and its silent, living ghost behind. The fire was discovered, just as they had planned, by a farmer before dawn. By the time the volunteer fire brigade and the Guardia Civil arrived, the entire nursery wing had collapsed into a smoldering ruin. They found Sister Agnes wandering the grounds, her face vacant, her lips moving without a sound. The official investigation was a formality, overseen by men who answered to the bishop. The conclusion was swift. Faulty wiring, a tragic accident. The shell-shocked nun was declared mentally unfit, a victim of unspeakable trauma. The aftermath for the conspirators was equally swift and quiet. Bishop Valerio, upon receiving the news of the terrible tragedy, issued a public statement of profound grief and called for a week of prayer throughout the diocese. Days later, he had Dr. Vance brought to his study in the dead of night. The doctor, haggard and broken, was given a choice. He could attempt to tell his story, a story that would be dismissed as the ravings of a madman complicit in the deaths of children, a story that would bring ruin not only to himself, but to his family back in Madrid, whose address the bishop recited with chilling nonchalance. Or he could accept a generous purse of money, leave Spain forever, and never speak of St. Jude's again. Dr. Vance, defeated and fearing for his loved ones, took the money. He boarded a ship for Argentina the next day and vanished into history. Sister Agnes was quietly transferred to the Sanatorium of Perpetual Penance, a remote asylum for the mentally afflicted run by an austere order of monks loyal to the bishop. Her catatonia was diagnosed as a holy madness, her silence a sign that she was communing with angels. She was locked away from the world, her testimony silenced forever by the very institution she had served. Mother Superior Elena was publicly lauded for her strength during the crisis before being reassigned for her own spiritual recovery. She was sent to run a wealthy convent in the north, a significant promotion. Her role in the tragedy was buried under layers of ecclesiastical paperwork and official commendations. Ricardo, the groundskeeper, was given a small plot of land and a pension, ensuring his loyalty and his silence for the rest of his life. The conspiracy was complete. The cover-up was perfect. The official story became the accepted history, a sad footnote in the annals of the region. The truth, like the bodies of the 32 infants, was buried deep, seemingly destined to be consumed by the earth and forgotten by time. For 88 years, the silence held. The story of the St. Jude's Orphanage fire solidified into a piece of local folklore, a tragic tale whispered to frightened children, a footnote in the regional archives that gathered dust and was forgotten. The charred ruins of the nursery wing were eventually torn down, and nature slowly reclaimed the land. Wildflowers grew over the unmarked mass grave behind the chapel, their beauty a silent, unknowing tribute to the horrors buried beneath. Bishop Matteo Valerio rose to the rank of cardinal, dying in his 90s as a revered and powerful figure in the Spanish Church. His state funeral a grand affair attended by dignitaries. Mother Superior, Elena, lived out her years in quiet authority, remembered as a pillar of piety and strength. Sister Agnes never spoke again. She died in the Sanatorium of Perpetual Penance in 1978, her secret locked away behind eyes that had seen too much. The conspiracy had been a resounding success. The truth, it seemed, had been cremated along with the building. History, however, has a long memory and a peculiar habit of revealing its secrets in the most mundane of circumstances. In the autumn of 2012, the land on which St. Jude's once stood was sold to a corporate vintner for the development of a new vineyard. The old chapel and the Mother Superior's quarters were to be preserved as a historic centerpiece, but the last remaining structure, the small, dilapidated groundskeeper's cottage where Ricardo had lived out his silent, pensioned life, was slated for demolition. A young architectural historian from the University of Seville, a woman named Sofia Reyes, was assigned to document the cottage before it was torn down. She saw it as a tedious task, a final look at an insignificant outbuilding. She spent a day photographing the crumbling plaster walls and rotting floorboards, making notes on the simple, rustic construction. As the demolition crew began their work, pulling down the back wall with a loud groan of splintering wood, Sophia noticed something unusual. In the cavity of the stone wall, where a large support beam had just been removed, sat a small, dark object wrapped in what looked like oilskin and tied shut with twine that had grown brittle with age. Assuming it was an old relic or a forgotten personal effect of the former groundskeeper, she called for the crew to halt. She carefully retrieved the package, the oilskin crackling under her touch. It was surprisingly heavy. In the quiet of her car, away from the noise of the machinery, she carefully untied the twine, which disintegrated into dust in her fingers. She peeled back the layers of stiff, waxy cloth. Inside was a leather-bound physician's logbook. The cover was warped by moisture, but the gold leaf lettering was still faintly visible. Dr. Alejandro Vance, medical log, 1924. Sophia's heart began to beat faster. She knew the name from the official report on the St. Jude's fire. He was the attending physician, a man who had left the region shortly after the tragedy. The existence of this book was an anomaly the official records never mentioned. She opened it, and the smell of old paper, ink, and a faint, lingering scent of carbolic acid rose from its pages. The first several entries were exactly what she expected: neat, clinical observations of routine childhood illnesses, records of births, notes on the health of the young mothers. But then, she turned a page, and the entire tone of the book changed. The entry was dated the 3rd of April, 1924. The handwriting was still precise, but an undercurrent of concern was palpable. Infant, cot 7. Presents with severe pyrexia, 40C, and an anomalous macular rash on the torso and limbs. Lesions are dark, almost purple, resembling subcutaneous hemorrhages. Have not seen its like. Recommend immediate isolation. Mother Superior has refused. Sophia read on, completely engrossed, the sounds of the demolition fading into the background. She watched, page by page, as Dr. Vance's scientific detachment crumbled into frantic desperation. She saw his detailed sketches of the horrifying rash, his notes on the terrifying speed of the contagion. His handwriting grew more agitated, the ink blots more frequent. She read his account of the confrontation with Mother Superior Elena, his words practically leaping from the page with righteous fury. She called it a trial of faith, as if God is a sadist who experiments on newborns. We must have help. There are now 9 sick. Then came the entry that made a cold dread snake up her spine. It described his final, desperate plea and the Mother Superior's response. The main gate has been locked. She has imprisoned us. We are not a sanctuary. We are a tomb. God help us. God help these children. From that point on, the logbook ceased to be a medical document. It became a confession, a testament, the last words of a man documenting a crime he was powerless to stop. Sophia's hands trembled as she turned to the final pages. They were stained and warped, as if by tears. The writing was a barely legible scrawl, the pen having been pressed so hard it had torn through the paper in places. It was not a narrative. It was a list. The first heading read, "Children Lost to the Sickness." It was followed by 23 names: Mateo, Isabella, Juan. Little common Spanish names that suddenly felt monumental. Then came a second heading, written in a different, even more jagged hand, as if penned by a man in the final throes of despair. Children murdered by order of the bishop, administered by Mother Superior. Elena. On this, the 14th night of the contagion. Below it were the final 9 names: Rafael, Lucia, Antonio, Maria, Miguel, Sofia, Leonor, Pablo, Catalina. 32 names in total, and next to every single name, all 32 of them. From the first to die from the disease, to the last to be murdered by the needle, Dr. Vance had written the same single heartbreaking word over and over again, a frantic prayer for an absolution he would never receive. Perdóname. 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 Forgive me. The logbook was the key. It was the Rosetta Stone for a history of lies. It proved there was no fire. It proved there was a deadly, unknown plague. And it proved that the highest authority of the regional church, in a conspiracy with the head of the orphanage, had ordered the systematic murder of 9 surviving infant children and orchestrated an elaborate cover-up to hide their crime. A crime committed not for God, but for the preservation of power and the avoidance of scandal. The lost document, hidden in a wall by a terrified doctor a lifetime ago, had finally spoken. It gave names to the nameless victims, exposed the guilt of the sainted perpetrators, and screamed a truth that had been silenced for nearly a century. The ashes of St. Jude's were not from an accident. They were from an atrocity. The bishop justified the murder of 9 children as a necessary sacrifice to protect the church, an institution he saw as the bedrock of civilization for millions. This brings us to a chilling question. Can a monstrous act ever be justified if it's committed for what the perpetrator genuinely believes is a greater good? Let us know your thoughts on this impossible moral calculation in the comments. The story of St. Jude's Orphanage is a chilling reminder that the most monstrous acts in history are often not the product of chaotic evil or mindless violence. They are the result of cold, rational decisions made by people in power to protect an institution. They are born in quiet, paneled offices and carried out by those who convince themselves that their terrible deeds are necessary, that the sacrifice of the few is a justifiable price for the stability of the many. The official record is often little more than a carefully constructed narrative, and the truth is a fragile thing, easily buried under the weight of authority and the passage of time. But it is never truly gone. It waits, silently, in the hidden cavities of old walls, in the desperate ink of a forgotten journal, for a future that is willing to listen. Thank you for joining us for this dark chapter of the past. If you find value in these deep dives and believe these stories need to be told, the best way to support our work is to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who won't shy away from the truth. It tells us this history still matters.